Well, good morning again, church. This morning we're going to be looking at that scripture passage that Nicole read for us, but there's a few things I want to talk about first before we get there. In all my travels and all my life experiences, which I think at this point count something like 15 countries on 5 continents. In all my conversations and all my interactions with people, I've yet to meet anyone who has never needed to forgive someone else. It hasn't happened. I have a hunch it's probably never going to happen. Maybe there's someone here who's never needed to forgive someone for something they said or did. Anybody? No? No? Okay. It's a sad reality in our fallen world that we live in some way or another, at some point in time, maybe at multiple points in time, people are going to hurt us. So what do we do when people hurt us? It may not seem like it, but we've always got a choice. Always have several options of how we're going to respond when someone hurts us. We can bury it or ignore it, pretending that it never happened or that it didn't affect us, moving on as if that didn't matter. It didn't matter that we were hurt. Number 2, we can choose to nurse that hurt, harboring a grudge and allowing that hurt to grow into resentment and bitterness in our hearts, refusing to move on and keeping ourselves captive to that pain. Or we can choose to forgive, which sounds easy and it's probably the right Sunday school answer, but I don't think forgiveness is all that simple, and it's rarely that easy. See, there's a lot of misunderstanding or misconception about what forgiveness is, much of which comes out of cultural cliches like forgive and forget, or sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. So I want to take a few minutes this morning before we get to this beautiful story from Luke to talk about what forgiveness means. And I've found that when it comes to difficult or significant concepts, it's often easier to begin to define the idea by first articulating what the idea is not. So, just quickly, here are a few things that forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not condoning evil. It's not saying that what happened was okay. Forgiveness is not surrendering the right to justice. There may still need to be something done on the part of that person who hurt us that needs to be set right. Forgiveness is not rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices. My forgiving someone may not take away the consequences they still have to face. Forgiveness is also not reconciliation. I can still choose to forgive you even if you're not sorry or never ask for forgiveness. But it doesn't mean that our relationship has been restored. Forgiveness is not permitting or inviting further hurt. Just like forgiveness isn't saying that what happened was okay, it is also doesn't mean that you allow that person to keep hurting you. Forgiveness is not the end of those feelings of pain or anger. Choosing to forgive doesn't mean that you stop feeling. Finally, forgiveness is not forgetting. As much as we'd like it to be true, we can't forgive and forget. Only God can do that. And remembering what happened doesn't mean you haven't forgiven. So that's a few things that forgiveness is not. But what is it? What does it mean to forgive someone? At its simplest level, forgiveness is choosing not to hold someone's action or attitude against them. It means choosing to have the right heart attitude toward them and acting toward them with right behavior. Forgiveness is also both a decision and a process. Or maybe more accurately, it's a process of many decisions over and over again. When we choose to forgive someone, we're choosing to acknowledge the pain and the hurt that was caused. We're choosing to give up the idea that we can get even. Instead, we choose to bless rather than curse. We're choosing to find the humanity in the one who hurt us and treating them accordingly, even when it feels like they still don't deserve it. With all that in mind, let's take a look at what we can learn by pulling up a seat at today's meal, at the table that Jesus found himself at in Luke chapter 7. You see, Jesus had been invited to the home of another Pharisee for a meal. Are you sensing a pattern through some of these messages? Jesus keeps getting invited into the homes of these Pharisees. So he accepts the invitation, and they were all seated at a table. And this woman came in. But this wasn't just any woman. This was a woman with a reputation. The NIV calls her a sinful woman. So she was a woman with a reputation. And I'll just leave that there for the sake of our younger listeners in the congregation. But you adults probably don't have to stretch your imagination too far to understand what was being said. So this woman with a reputation comes in and she finds her way to Jesus' feet. Now, if you think about this like an American dinner where everyone's seated in a chair with their feet under the table, this is going to seem a little awkward. But you have to remember, this isn't an American dinner party, and Jesus and the other guests would have been seated on cushions around a low table with their feet out behind them. If you think about the picture that Da Vinci painted of the Last Supper, even he got it wrong. That's not what it would look like. So they're kind of reclining, they're laying there with their feet out away from the table. So she's standing by Jesus' feet, and she's weeping. And as she's weeping, her tears are falling onto Jesus' feet. And then she kneels down and begins to wash his feet. Wet with her tears, she's using her own hair. She's kissing them. She's pouring perfume on them. And there's Simon, the host of this dinner party, that Pharisee who invited Jesus in. He's standing there and he's watching all this happen. And he's appalled. First of all, he's appalled that this woman even made her way into his home. But he's also appalled that Jesus is allowing this to go on. And Luke tells us that Simon said to himself. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't say to his Pharisee friends. He didn't ask one of Jesus' disciples. Simon said to himself, "Some prophet this guy is. Doesn't he know what kind of woman this is who's touching him?" And Jesus, I love it. I hope by now you've seen he's got no problem calling anybody out. He calls out Simon. But not directly, not at first anyway. He just says, "Simon, hey, I've got something I'd like to tell you. Something I'd like to say." Simon said, "Okay, go ahead and tell me." So Jesus gives Simon this short parable about the people who owed some money to a lender. One owed 50 days' wages. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. The other owed 10 times that amount. 500 days, more than a year's worth of wages. Neither one could pay. So the lender decided to forgive both debts. And Jesus asked Simon, which of these borrowers is going to love the lender more? Who's going to be more grateful? It's pretty obvious, right? This wasn't just a layup. This was a free throw. And luckily, Simon wasn't Ben Simmons. So the host of the party, not wanting to overextend himself with his answer, he says, well, I suppose it was the one with the bigger debt. Obviously. And Jesus says simply, you're right. Absolutely. Now we get to the point that Jesus really wanted to make. Jesus turns to the woman, but he keeps speaking to Simon. And this woman, who I'm assuming is still kneeling there at Jesus' feet, and at this point is probably wondering where all this is going. Jesus turns to the woman, but he keeps speaking to Simon, and he begins to contrast the way that this woman honored him with the way that Simon has welcomed Jesus into his home, or failed to welcome him into his home. Jesus says, you didn't give me water to wash the dust off my feet. If you've ever been in a culture where people walk most places and you wear sandals, by the time you get where you're going, your feet are pretty gross. So you take your shoes off by the front door and you walk in. And someone's there and they offer to wash your feet. But Jesus says, you didn't give me water to wash the dust off my feet, but this woman, she's used her own tears, her own hair to wash them. You didn't welcome me with a kiss of friendship, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put any oil on my head to refresh me, but she's anointed me with perfume. You've shown little love, but she has shown me much love, because her sins, and they were many, they were, but they've been forgiven. And Jesus tells her that her sins are forgiven. That caused its own little uproar, but Jesus sends her on her way and says, go in peace, because your faith has saved you. I said earlier that I had never met anyone who didn't need to forgive someone. But I've also never met anyone who didn't need to be forgiven. The theologian Miroslav Volf said in his book, Exclusion and Embrace, forgiveness founders when I exclude my enemy from the company of humanity, and when I exclude myself from the company of sinners. The reality is, we all need to be forgiven by those we've hurt, but also by God. Like the borrowers in Jesus' parable, it seems like some of us have bigger debts than others. But when it comes to our sin, debt is debt. As Paul wrote in Romans, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the result of that sin, the result of that debt to sin, is death. Separation from God. But because of God's great love for us, Christ died for us, even while we were still in debt to our sin, even while we were still sinning. God canceled the debt against us. As we said when we were defining what forgiveness is, God chose to not hold the hurt that we had caused him against us. He extended that forgiveness so that we could be reconciled to him, so that the relationship that he always intended to have with us could be restored. Jesus said to the woman with the reputation, she loved much because she had been forgiven much. Sisters and brothers, I want to submit to you today that no matter how good you think you were apart from Christ, no matter how small your debt might seem in comparison to someone else, you have been forgiven much. And if you and I have been forgiven much, then our lives should be marked by that same kind of extravagant love for God that this woman showed to Jesus that day. The kind of love that throws off cultural expectations, the kind of love that expresses itself freely, no matter who else is looking on. I think one of the great tragedies of the English language is that we only have one word for love. We only have one word for love, and we've stretched it so out of shape by trying to cram so many different meanings into it. It's hardly recognizable sometimes. Think about it. I use the same word to describe the way I feel about Meg as I do to talk about mint chocolate chip ice cream, which is also one of my favorites. The same word I use to describe my feelings as a father towards my 4 sons as I do to talk about a football team, which is also the Eagles, just for the record, let it be known. That also happens on September 12th, so don't worry, I'll get you out in time. In our culture today, love can mean anything from romantic interest to a great concern for something, to infatuation, to affection, to unqualified acceptance. But this isn't what the Bible is talking about when it talks about love. When John wrote, "For God so loved the world," he wasn't saying because God was infatuated with the world. He wasn't saying because God gave such a unqualified acceptance to what was going on in the world. The biblical view of love is willing, desiring the best for the other person. It's a self-sacrificing, self-giving for the good of another. Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that a person lay down their life for another." Friends, if we've experienced the forgiveness of God that cancels our debt and restores our relationship with him, then our lives ought to be marked by extravagant love. Extravagant love for God and extravagant love for others. People should be able to see from our lives, from the way we love one another, that we are followers of Jesus. And if our lives are marked more by our love for something else than it is for God or neighbor, whether it's a sports team or a hobby, a habit, a favorite vacation place, fill in whatever blank makes you feel like your toes are being stepped on. If our love for that marks us more than our love for God and other people, then something still needs to change in us. So here's a little test for us today as we close. See if we're living a life of love in response to the forgiveness that we've received from God. As I read, anywhere you hear the word love, put your name in there. Put your name in there. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. Love is not proud. Love does not dishonor others. Love is not self-seeking. Love is not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails.